All right, this is the great speech, the big speech. We are talking about the World War II era here, and we are focused on a midpoint of it. Um, our host this week, we do have Mike, Matt, Ross, and Landon are all on. And who are we talking about? What are we talking about this week, Ross?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Landon. So we are going to be covering Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States of America. And last week we learned about the great "We'll fight on the beaches" speech. And as Winston predicted, sometime the new world will have to come in for the liberation of the old, I believe is what he said. So
Could
eventually,
you how is it that Winston said it? Could you try to say it like him?
and the new world with all of its power and might. That's all I got.
Thank you.
But it was going to happen. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that got its kickoff. So before we get too much into the speech, though, um, that infamous day, if you will, we're going to give a little background on FDR himself. So because he's a pretty interesting figure. I mean, we've all heard of FDR. He was a president during the Great Depression, president during World War II. So pretty influential, big name. So we've all heard about him, but a couple of just things to run through. So he was the 32nd president of the United States, and he was president, get this, from 1933 until 1945. That's right. 12 years he was the president. You guys might be asking,
Elected for 16 years. Almost became
yeah,
King Roosevelt.
won four consecutive terms was he elected as the president of the United States. You guys might be wondering, how is that possible? I thought you could only do it twice. That was the 22nd Amendment enacted after Roosevelt's presidency to pretty much try to stop that from happening again. Yeah, because he did win four consecutive elections. So he was a Democrat, again, president for those 12 years. First elected during kind of in the middle of the Great Depression, and then obviously saw us through that into the Second World War. So a couple other things about him, just a little background. Um, he was a well-educated guy. He went to Harvard College, and then he later went to Columbia Law School. He's a member of the Roosevelt family, who we've all heard of from our friend Teddy Roosevelt. They were kind of distantly related. Um, and kind of a major player for most of his adult life. So he was a state senator, then he was assistant secretary of the Navy during World War I, later governor of New York before finally being elected president of the United States. Um, Interesting tidbit because a lot of times you'll see him, he's in the wheelchair. He That was in 1921, so he was well into his adult life and career when he developed an illness which paralyzed him. So that was not something he was born with. So anyway, that's kind of a couple things on Roosevelt. But before we jump too much into the World War, something he's really known for, to as part of his attempt to get us out of the Great Depression, is the New Deal. And I think we kind of see an ode to that with the kind of liberals, the Green New Deal of today. So anybody want to give a quick explanation of the New Deal and why that was a big deal for Roosevelt?
Yeah, I think the New Deal got him elected. I think he had quite a quite a bit of a sharper perspective on the economy and how to turn it around. Following it was Hoover, right? Am I correct on that? He followed Hoover.
Yeah, Hoover was the president when the Depression first happened.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so the New Deal, I think, besides World War II, like top of mind um thing you think about with Roosevelt is like the New Deal, social programs, pretty much everything we know, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the farmer subsidies and supports, the Agriculture Commodities Act, Conservation Corps that built all the trails and national parks and the lodges that this crew likes to frequent on their camping journeys were all a byproduct of how to like get America working again off of 20-30% unemployment. Um, but that was 3 years after the Great Depression. I think the Great Depression started this huge global tumultuous cycle. But it didn't happen that fast or even like get that deep right away. The stock market crashed In October of 29, it went from like 350 down to 200. Not that far off of the COVID stock market crash that we saw. Like that in and of itself, it was bad, but it didn't immediately like halt the global economy. Um, what also followed was a super severe drought, the Dust Bowl, in the heartland in 1930, and then general consumer expectations. Everybody was already starting to save, and they didn't spend, and that just created a deflationary cycle of like, we're not going to spend, so prices are going to go down. That stopped production, companies stopped hiring, wages went down, and created this spiral that just bled out over 3 years. And by the time Roosevelt was elected in 33, he had to turn it around with all kinds of social programs in the first 100 days that he really, I think, kind of used a lot more executive power to move the economic needle than had been done by presidents before, and really almost remolded the presidency in that manner, since 33.
Okay, so you've got not only is he president for longer than anyone else has been president, but then he also enacts these policies, these new things that, kind of like you said, were kind of a new thing for a president to do, to try to get the country going out of its worst depression. So, I mean, just those two things alone make him a huge influential figure. And now we have to throw in that he also was the president that ushered the United States into, the biggest war of all time. So, I think he's pretty interesting, worth spending some time with. Some of the stuff he wrote, some of the stuff he said. Um, but again, before we jump too much into the speech, because I'll be totally honest, the first time I listened to the speech, it doesn't quite have the pizzazz or I don't want to use the word flair, but energy. When you listen to the fight on the beaches, it kind of just gives you this sense of inner, like, yeah, yeah, rah, rah. And this one just does not seem to do that. But I felt like it was so for someone listening to this speech, this many years after, we're in a time when that is not a threat to us. Um, it just doesn't have much gut wrenching power to me, to be totally honest. But I
Yeah.
feel like it might be a little bit helpful just for the listeners and for ourselves to put ourselves in the place of people at the time. So we talked a lot about, Britain during kind of the beginning of World War II. I think we mentioned it in our last episode how England or London got bombed like 50 some nights in a row. But I think it would be to really understand the speech and what it meant for the people and why it had the influence that it did. I think you have to kind of put yourself in the place of the people living at the time, if that makes sense. Um, so again, before I don't want to jump too much into like just avoid the speech, but I feel like that little bit of context might be a little bit helpful to get more out of it.
Yeah, so I think it would be interesting to talk about Britain first, and I'm glad you mentioned like the London bombings and all that because I think because that went on before this speech. And I imagine the American people would be like pretty well aware of the war in Europe and what was going on, and especially what Britain was going through, just with them being close allies and sharing the same language and history and whatnot. Um, so the bombings that you're talking about, the Blitzkrieg started in 1940, but like there was definitely some fears about that going back to like 1938. So the British government actually distributed 40 million gas masks to the British public in 1938, and they started producing millions of cardboard coffins just in like preparation for like the carnage they were expecting. Um, September 7th, 1940 was the beginning of a stretch of 267 days where the Germans bombed London 71 times throughout that stretch. Ross, I think you said 50 days in a row or something. I don't know if that's 100% true, but certainly 71 times in a stretch of less than a year. That's one every 3 3/4 days. There's a bombing going on. Um, so air raids or air raid shelters, blackouts, rationing were all like very routine in England. They had shelters made of corrugated steel. Most of them were either underground or kind of semi-underground. Um, and a lot of British citizens were given ration books for basic staples that not every item needed rationing, but quite a few. So the American people would have been pretty well aware of like the types of things they might be facing if a war was imminent. At least I imagine most of the people who are reading the news were. Um, so at the time of the speech, the United States was still in somewhat of a depression. Unemployment was at 15% still, as of 1940, which is down from the 25% it was at the height of the depression. Subsequent years, it would drop quite a bit. Um, but but yeah, things were starting to amp up in terms of rearmament in the United States. So there's definitely a sense of fear, a sense of preparation, um, and yeah, gasoline, meat, and clothing were probably the some of the more tightly rationed items um, leading up to this speech. Another interesting thing leading up to this speech. So I looked up FDR's approval ratings, at least according to Gallup. So Gallup is probably one of the more reliable and furthest dating back polling organizations. So right before this speech, he was actually at a really, really high approval rating. So he had about a 70% approval rating. Um, Shortly after this speech, his approval rating went up to 83%, which is pretty remarkable for U.S. presidents. Um, so anyway, I suppose maybe I jumped the gun a little bit with some of the uh, how the Breeze speech was accepted, but that's kind of setting the scene for what the American people are where they're at pre this speech.
83%. My gosh. Does anyone know what the record is for any U.S. president approval rating?
George Washington, 100%.
So I'm cheating a little bit because I did look up a bunch of these. I don't know for sure. I think it might have been George W. Bush after 9/11 because he was at 91% at that point.
91% he was.
According to Gallup, yeah. According to Gallup,
Yeah. I see George W. Bush. Yeah, September 21st, 2001. George W. Bush was 90%. His lowest was 25%. 7 years later in October of 2008. Wow. I mean, there's no one lower than 25 except for Nixon and Truman. No, wait. Somehow, oh wait, no. That works. Huh.
All right, so we've talked about Roosevelt, the New Deal, the Great Depression. We haven't got to the speech yet. Is that right? Is that where we're at?
Yeah, we're almost
Yeah.
there though. We're almost there.
Okay,
We're getting
hold
there.
on,
We're getting
hold
there.
on, hold on. What I found interesting, I think when we think of the Great Depression, we're always like, America, the stock market crash, the Dust Bowl. The Great Depression is the reason World War II happened and what it did to Europe, and Germany in particular, was actually a little bit of the firecracker for all of this, or at least it helped stoke much of what happened abroad because Wall Street crashed. So even, Wall Street crashes today, the global economy is in a turmoil. Like that has been the case for at least a century. I think this is the first instance of it was in 29. So when Wall Street crashed, what happened was the first investment bank to go bankrupt because of that was Credit Almstadt in Vienna in May of 31. It did take 2 years, but the Goldman Sachs of Europe in Vienna went bankrupt. Why does that matter? Well, it was owned by Mr. Rothschild. Ever heard of that name? The Rothschilds? You haven't heard?
I've heard of them.
Those robber barons, is that what they're called?
So the Rothschilds were a Jewish family who basically set up shop in like Paris and London and Rome and Vienna. And before everyone could text each other, they were just a family who they had communication lines between all the major countries and very much did investment banking too. They invented it essentially. They were heavily invested in the US. But as a result of the US Wall Street banking collapse, they collapsed too. They were helping to administer to finance the rebuilding of Europe post World War One. Now it had been 12 years. Um, but what ended up occurring was they went bankrupt. That hurt the Dows and the Young Act that were rebuilding Germany, and Germany had to pay France back, and all this is being handled via Wall Street and the Rothschilds. They went bankrupt. So Germany starts going in a tailspin, 25% unemployment by 32. Hitler lost the 32 election, but gained enough support that he easily won it in 31. And the effects of Germany having to work back their debt from World War One were exasperated immensely by the Great Depression. Because this investment bank in Vienna failed, Hitler ran a lot of propaganda against Jews and their inability or the social and economic troubles that Germany was having, and fanned the flame for some of the racial things he did, but it also made it very easy for him to take this depression, the bad terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the bad terms of some of the acts that followed, and dial up the heat on that to go invade the territories that he took away. So I really think in some of my reading, like the Great Depression hurt America, but it actually perhaps even affected Europe more and was the start of this war that we did not enter into even, until a decade later.
Man, that's fascinating. That
Yeah.
really makes one look at the year 2020 with a little bit more positivity for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so looking at that then, like I think that those are interesting things, like just the what the effects or the aftermath of the Great Depression, kind of what it created in Europe. Obviously, things were not great in the United States, so I feel like that ties in well, kind of like what with a little bit of Matt had said, like this kind of uncertainty, fear. People are just kind of maybe not in the most stable place. I mean, all those things that I guess right now 2020 produces somewhat of similar things for a lot of people who maybe lost their jobs or out or whatever, but might make them receive the speech differently than someone living in a more prosperous time, if that makes sense, I guess. Um, but kind of the last thing before jumping into the speech, then, I think to really set a little bit of context or tone to try to listen to it. It's not just I mean, he gave the speech the day after Pearl Harbor, so it's not just, oh, things are really bad in Europe. Oh, we might get, you know, they might get like that here, that type of thing. But then you obviously have Pearl Harbor happen. But I guess something that just jumped into my head a little bit. Does anyone know? I did not look this up, so I do not. But does anyone know was there any public support for entering into World War II before Pearl Harbor? What's the average American thinking at that time? Does anyone look into that?
Well, it was a mix. I think generally, I know for sure it was a mix. Whether it weighed one way or another more. No, it definitely weighed more against going to war because one of FDR's campaign promises was, "I will not go to war." But obviously that did not happen. So definitely, America did not want to participate in World War II.
And it goes to, time is short. Like the foundation of American foreign policy, as soon as the Revolutionary War ended, was like, we're not going to get involved. Like, let the old world beat itself up every 2 decades. We had to get involved in World War One. But I would imagine some of that sentiment of stay out of foreign affairs was definitely still around post World War One, and to stay on the sideline.
Yeah, I guess it's jumping off that too. Just now, I'm just thinking out loud, but I would imagine just after after World War One, how terrible and traumatic that was, the amount of people died, all of that. I would imagine people were not exactly gung ho about you know doing it again and going back to Europe, if you will. Um, but anyway, so you've got FDR, who's pretty well liked by the American people. He's been president for a long time. He's ushered in all these programs, and then obviously Britain's kind of not doing great. The war is going on in Europe. Hitler's taken over. France is pretty much fallen. You've got the Blitz, 40 million gas masks, all this, and then you have December 7th of 1941. So the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and that is obviously the kind of the jumping ground for the speech we're about to go over. But uh, just thinking about Pearl Harbor, I don't know how you guys think about it. In my mind, I always kind of compare it to like a 9/11. Would you guys say that's fair?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Yes.
So I think, I mean, even death, like casualty rates are somewhat similar, I believe. Sorry, I didn't look this. I don't have the actual numbers in front of me, but I'm pretty sure they were both between 2 and 3,000 people.
Yeah, it was like
Yeah.
3,000 people, I think, for the
Yeah.
fatality.
Yeah, and I think that the Pearl Harbor was a little bit less than 9/11, but I mean, similar ballpark. So if you've got the United States of America, this big, powerful country coming out of the Great Depression, big military, has so far tried to stay neutral, why in the world would someone do this attack that would pretty surely usher in us entering the war? Thoughts?
Why would someone commit this attack? Is that the question?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the situation, you've got war in Europe and you've got war in the world, and you've got this huge major superpower, pretty much staying neutral. So why would someone, swing, make the first punch, if you will? I mean, when you could pretty easily foresee that then they are going to get involved in the war.
Yeah, that's a good question. I, for some reason, never really thought about that. I'm hoping you have the answer. I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm practically tipping over here.
I don't think I really have a good answer. I mean, I kind of think Churchill even comments on it in his speech at the end of the beaches. Someday the new world with all its power and might, blah blah blah. It just seems to me odd that then, I mean, I'm gonna guess it's something to the effect of they foresaw us entering the war at some point, and we're gonna try to hit when we didn't expect it, or they maybe would have a better chance of inflicting a lot of damage. So almost it's gonna happen anyway. We might as well get the first shot in. I'm gonna guess that's it. I don't know if that's how accurate that is, but that's really the only reason I can think of that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I'm getting some information from Steve here. Just that might be some food for thought. Population of Japan in 1941 is 73 million. Population of United States in 1941 is almost double that, 133 million. Let's do one more number check. I'm getting one more number from Steve. United States military size in 1941. We had 1.3 million active duty troops. And Japan, 1941 military size. Wow, bigger than ours. 1.7 million people. That's crazy.
Yeah, I would not have expected that, to be honest, either.
So Japan, to also fact check, Japan was not that affected by the Great Depression. They got out of it by about 33. But what they were doing, they had just, a very old, um, large history and their own culture for, perhaps centuries longer than most of our Western culture history books or whatever. The East is just as old as the West, maybe older. They had watched Great Britain take over the world, 1700s, 1800s. Now we're in a modern day. They watched World War I unfold. Um, Mike, what did you just say? How many people? The U.S. was barely double their size.
Yeah, the U.S. was not quite double their size, 100
Yeah,
versus Japan's 73
right.
million.
But what's the geography of Japan? Guess.
It's square footage. I feel like Japan's like about the size of California.
Right on. Size of California. So many people on an island in the 20th century, knowing that the United States, Great Britain have conquered all in order to keep their supply chains and people hungry and fed. Like the number one rule of government and societies was like you need oil and food. And so they had built up enough of a military power and had strategic plans to basically take over the Southeast Pacific area. Like this was a time for them to conquer. I think they had some alliances, at least with Italy and Germany and the Axis powers, but they were about to go on a tear and shore up more land and resources to keep Tokyo fed. And they didn't want the US to get in the way. So they just, swiftly decided to cut out our legs, where we might get involved and stop them from taking over the Philippines or whatnot. I don't know if we had any certain claims of that, but they were about to get aggressive for, I wouldn't say noble purposes at all, but at least strategic resources purposes, and started with Hawaii.
Yeah, that seems pretty similar. I mean, for my on the spot research here, it seems similar that they were just trying to um, pretty much prevent American naval powers or presence in Southeast Asia that they thought was somewhat inevitable. Hence the attack on our bases in Hawaii on Pearl Harbor. So I guess anyway, that's the background of the speech, if you will. So you've got FDR. Does anyone have? So I guess we talked about his approval rating. I just think that's interesting. So Bush's jumped to what 90% after 9/11. So you've got an already popular president in FDR. Now they've been attacked. So I would assume there's similar public sentiment, after this attack on our country, on our military base in Hawaii, that there was that, the U.S. had, that we all remember after 9/11. So all that said, I just feel like that's helpful because I do think that the speech, not that it's boring, but it just doesn't have the flair, or I think the or maybe not the rhetorical power, but the impact that Churchill's does on someone who's not really living through the times.
Can I
But
say one more interesting thing about FDR's approval rating? I'm looking at various presidents' approval rating on the approval rating page of Wikipedia. There's a general pattern for everyone in that they generally just go down through all their 1 or 2 terms. President Trump's is virtually the exact same the entire term. Interesting. But FDR's goes gradually up throughout the whole thing. His is the only one that does that, compared to Bush, Eisenhower, Trump. Like I said, is on this page. I closed it out, unfortunately, but yeah, interesting little bit there.
only question. So, I mean, was there like a spike though? Because this is, I guess, not the end of his presidency, but I mean, did it spike? Like you said, it went up. Do you feel like that was somehow corresponded to these attacks on Pearl Harbor, where you have George Bush, where his improvement was high, where 9/11 was early on in his presidency, where you've got FDR, the attacks are at least on the second half of his presidency. Does that make sense?
So based on, I'm looking at the same graph you are, Mike. Based on the timing of it, just because it has like over the span of a year, and that's like the whole, that's like one small portion of the graph. It's hard to tell the exact timing of the speech and the approval rating, but it looks, I mean, it's basically shortly after that, when we're first getting into the war, is when there is a, I suppose you could call it a spike, but it was kind of, I mean, not that far off the trajectory of where things were going. Yeah, his approval rating was going up quite a bit. Bush's was like an unbelievable straight up spike. Like he was hovering right around 55%. and then shoots way up to 90. So not even. I mean, I would say FDR's goes up maybe 5 points after as we enter the war. Um, yeah, George W. Bush is 45 points after 9/11.
Do you think approval ratings matter? You're president of a country. You're going through these tumultuous, grinding, big decision times. Do you lean on the sentiment of the people for your decision making, or do you lean on your advisor's gut, personal, worldly perspective?
You're
Yeah.
asking should they matter or do they matter?
Either one. Take it however you want.
Well, of course they shouldn't matter, but depending upon what president you are, you're going to let that affect you more or less in decision making, right? So, um, yeah, should they matter? No. Do they matter? It depends on the president in terms of how much they affect his or someday her decision making.
I don't know that they shouldn't matter because they are presiding over the American people, so like the will, so to speak, um, isn't negligible. Obviously, you can't like make all of your decisions based on that sort of stuff. But yeah, I would agree that varying presidents have varying degree of influenceability. But
I kind of I agree with Matt a little bit. Like on one hand, yeah, like what Schaefer said, like they shouldn't matter, right? Because presidents might get blamed for things that aren't necessarily their fault, or that. I mean, you could go on and on and on. But at the same time, I mean, if their job is to lead the American people, you would think that not that it's the only measure of a president, but you'd think you'd have to at least consider, are the people happy under your leadership, if that makes sense. I feel like that's at least one outcome that would be helpful in determining how good of a job the president's doing. But
you also have to think about, are you saying, do they matter in terms of evaluating the actual effectiveness of a president, or because that's another thing too. If you're looking in retrospect, you can't really judge a president by their approval rating, I wouldn't say, or at least it's awfully hard to. Like, I don't know if George Bush was really 45% better at 9/11 than he was when he left office, or whatever the difference was. So yeah, it's hard to use that as a measure, but I think it is just as at least as a gauge of the public support for the war. Because I mean, I imagine most of the American people were probably thinking that this was going to happen at some point, and they seem to be on board with it. And just seeing the response to the speech, they're on board with it. But I'll let Ross. I think we'll keep stepping on Ross's toes with that. So we'll let Ross. Are we gonna hear part of the speech, or what's next?
I'm gonna read a part of the speech.
Speech.
Yes,
Speech.
So the speech, like we said, it's over 7 minutes long, which really, if you think about it, for a presidential speech is not very long. One of the things I was reading kind of said that was a deliberate choice by Roosevelt, but I'm not going to read for 7 minutes. So I'll try to do, I think the first part is the most recognizable. I feel like I'll just start and then we can talk about it a little bit. Sound fair?
There.
Okay. And I do not have any sort of FDR impression, so this is just going to be read in my own voice.
It's like a thick Bostonian 1930s accent.
Yeah, so not a kid from Central Illinois. Here we go. Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation and, at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat or hint of war or of armed attack. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The attack the attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. I'll stop there. But I feel like the first part is when he actually says, this a date which will live in infamy is probably the most known or the most recognizable from the speech. I don't just listening to it. It was interesting, I guess. I had never listened to the whole speech before. It like how much time he kind of takes in it because it's a relatively short speech of pretty much setting up the stage that we had been in these negotiations and we were pretty deliberately deceived by Japan. That's just kind of one thing that stuck out to me is I guess I maybe wasn't aware. Just apparently we had been trying to negotiate peace or at least talk about peace, and he almost sets them up as the bad guy in the sense that they were deliberately deceiving us, knowing that what they were about to do. But like I said, outside of that, it's just overall. I mean, I don't think it has the gut wrenching effect of the fight on the beaches, but I mean, kind of like we said, if you're actually in the time period and experienced Pearl Harbor, similar to George Bush's speech after 9/11, I'm sure it created quite a bit of rah 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 to the American public.
What does that say about the difference, though? I mean, Churchill is just like poetic and Shakespearean and like trying to like rally the troops after a devastating retreat at Dunkirk, and we just get attacked. And your description of FDR's speech is like, well, it's pretty boring. He's like, here was our diplomatic relations with Japan, and it fell through, and maybe we should do this thing. Like, is there any sort of thing to infer about Americans at the time? Like he's trying so hard to just be pragmatic. Are we so more pragmatic and less emotional in some way?
Yeah, and that's interesting. Oh,
I think context is important too because this was a address to Congress to ask for a declaration of war, which I think is a little bit more of a formal thing where you need to lay out your argument. You need to, as opposed to.
But wasn't it on the radio? Did the American? I mean, FDR was known for his
It might have
fireside
been, but
chats.
I mean, a lot of things are on the radio and TV and stuff. Like C-SPAN has a bunch of congressional hearings that are
I
super
don't
boring.
think C-SPAN was around.
Right, but I would say it's something so. You know what I mean? I don't know.
But
I
think
don't,
of
I don't
think
know
of the
about
House
that.
of Commons and even just what it is today. I mean, they scream and shout at each other.
I was gonna
And
say that's. I mean, like right? Just don't the Brits do that? Like, I mean, I'm basing this off the movie The Darkest Hour or whatever, I guess. But like, they scream and they wave their little white
you can
handkerchiefs.
you can watch them today. They're still in that same confined room shouting profanities. And the most emotional we get is like speech at a time to an empty room, raising our voice a little with like a poster, like "You're wrong, Mr. Democrat person." Like it's not
uh,
that profane.
I just got a message from Steve here. The speech was broadcast live.
Yeah,
The
it
infamy
was
speech
boring.
was broadcast live.
I mean, I don't mean to say it's boring in itself. I don't know if that's the only word I would take away from it. I'm just comparing it to We'll Fight on the Beaches. It just doesn't
But
have the power or
but
the
there were
pizzazz.
only 3 words that actually lived in infamy. This day will live in infamy. Like like that was all that was carried over. Like there's paragraphs from the Churchill speech.
So was that just the difference between Churchill and FDR? Like, was that just their personalities, you think?
I would say America's, generally speaking, a lot more pragmatic and a lot less poetic. You know, so I don't know that. Yeah, like I don't know that anyone really speaks that way in American politics.
Yeah, I can see where Matt's coming from there. I think there's probably some legitimacy there. I got a couple more fun facts about this speech here. 33 minutes after he finished speaking, Congress declared war. Only one representative, Jeanette Rankin, voted against the declaration of war. That sounds like a woman. Were there any women representatives back then?
There was at least one.
Are you sure that's a woman?
It is. She
Jeanette.
also voted. She was one of like 40 that voted against World War One. She was a known
Okay.
pacifist, but she was
Yeah.
the only one that voted against World War Two.
First woman to hold federal office in the United States.
Yeah, I think she's got a statue somewhere in DC. I don't know if it's the Capitol, but she's got a statue somewhere.
The woman who did not want to fight Hitler.
I mean,
I think
I
that's
was
a
gonna.
little. That might be painting this in a very untrue, inaccurate light. If she was, and yeah, they want peaceful. They don't want war. It's not that she didn't hate Hitler.
I just
That is
fight.
one thing I read up just looking reading into the home front and like that kind of culture or the nature of that leading up to the war. So before this, almost universally, churches in the United States were against the United States getting involved. It was only after Pearl Harbor that a lot of church, like prominent church people, whether pastors and different congregations, were actually on board with it. But there is a very strong, like, pacifist movement, at least among Christians in the U.S. Before Pearl Harbor, which I thought was interesting.
Was
So
there any
this-
sort of context for the change, like the justification?
I mean, I
there
think
were
just
other
the fact
pacifists.
that we got attacked.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine just the nature of the attack is what kind of changed at least the common church people. Because I mean, after that there was a fair amount of support, but
Yeah, I remember reading like I forget her name honestly already, sorry, but the who Mike mentioned that voted against going to World War II. She wasn't. I don't think she was the only like known pacifist around. I think the others switched because of the fact that we were attacked. They kind of said, okay, that kind of, I don't know if you want to say makes it justifiable, but that kind of triggered their change in heart to supporting the war, where she obviously did not.
yeah, pacifism was somewhat of a movement, so to speak, um, pre-war. But yeah, I guess she was the only one who really stuck with it.
I wonder what her arguments were. Like, oh yeah, like Europe's in shambles. We've now been attacked. Like, I don't know. Just like, did she want to do anything? Like, or just kind of nothing? Not obviously not
mean,
go to war, but like, did she want to invest in better defense in case the war came to our borders, or you know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we'll get that right away, but I would think in a body of like 400 people, like one person ought to vote against the war. Like that's completely fine, and I would think is part of a rational body of people in a spectrum of perspective.
Speaking of the, I guess to move away from our pacifists, but speaking of moving more into a non-pacifist, just we talked just briefly about like where their personalities had different, Churchill's and FDR's, but obviously they knew each other, worked closely together during World War II. But a scene I kind of found somewhat interesting I keep relating that Darkest Hour movie, but it's a pretty good movie. But have you guys seen it, The Darkest Hour? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Do you guys remember when Churchill phones FDR?
No, describe it for us.
So that is just an interesting scene in the movie because I feel like Churchill looked honestly a little wimpy in a movie that had a pretty strong like positive portrayal of him. But it's before he has much support. Some people still want to negotiate with Hitler. Things are still going really poorly. We haven't had the successful evacuation of the British military from France yet. And he calls FDR on the phone and pretty much is begging him for help. And FDR kind of him-haws around it and, oh, yeah, we'll do, blah, 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 but doesn't really give any sort of beneficial support. But does anyone, did they know each other well? I mean, before the war? Does anyone know?
No, they did not know each other particularly well. Obviously, they knew of each other before the war. I believe that they did actually meet each other in passing around 1918, of which FDR remembered. Churchill did not, and FDR was a little bit annoyed by this. But other than that, I believe it was not until, let me check my notes right here. 41, FDR and Churchill met for the first of 9 face-to-face conferences during the war. Correspondence between the two began in early 1940 when Churchill began writing FDR, asking U.S. to take more active anti-Axis role. So that is what we're looking at here. So, there's a little bit of antagonism at first because FDR's feelings were hurt that he was not remembered in
He
this
wasn't even that
1918
big of a
encounter.
deal in 1918. Like, I
Neither,
mean,
Yeah.
but
I-
still, like every time if you met someone and like 2 years later you meet him again, one of guys like, I don't remember, I don't know who you are. Like, I don't remember that. Like, it's nice to know world leaders still have the same feelings as us.
yeah. What's that? What'd you just call it, Landon? The Potsdam meeting? What's that?
Those were the later talks with Stalin involved. Stalin was at the Potsdam meeting
Oh,
when they're basically dividing up the world amongst each other.
it's a simple way to put it.
What a strange concept, just to think like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna sit at a table and divide the world like
I
me
mean,
and 5 other people.
it was bad. One of Churchill's notes, it was just like a list of countries on barely more than a napkin, and it was basically what ended up being the Eastern Bloc and the Iron Curtain. Like Churchill wrote, like, we're getting 100% of this country. We'll go 50-50 on this with the Soviets. And he didn't like put it in his pocket and it got out. You can like Google it. Um, and he was just like so cavalier with how they were going to divide up basically Eastern Europe between the Soviets and um, Great Britain. And Roosevelt, I think Roosevelt was like furious that like he let that get out and like how they were so cavalier, just like splitting things up, and it ended up falling along those lines. Um,
That's interesting. All right, so they weren't best buds, but they obviously were two leaders that greatly shaped the world following World War II and for obviously
Well,
up to this day.
now hold on, Ross. I mean, I didn't say they were best buds when they first met. Well, no. Yeah, no, that is what I said. I said they were not best buds when they first met. But who is? I mean, when I first met Landon, I thought, look at that rich white guy. Another rich white guy. Just what the world needs. But their friendship
When I when I
bloomed and matured.
when I first met Mike, he was literally, or the first memory I have of Mike, he was running barefoot and shirtless, and I was like, man, what a weirdo.
Again, friendships
Somebody
mature.
listens to NPR.
Friendships mature. I got shoes. I still often run without my shirt though. Um, so no, they did become legitimate friends despite their differences. And kind of the riff off of what Landon shared there. You know, FDR did not like, you know, Churchill still sort of having this colonialist idea of wanting to kind of collect and continue advancing the British Empire, versus FDR wanting to end that. There's one little interesting quote here that sort of like speaks into their friendship. But okay, this is from an article I was reading. They established an easy intimacy, a joking informality, and moratorium on and camp, and also a degree of frankness and intercourse, which, if not complete, was remarkably close to it. Roosevelt cabled Churchill after one of their meetings and said, "It is fun decade with you." I like that. That's just such. It sounds like, I don't know, something that we would say to each other.
I missed that. What did he say?
Say the last line again. You did cut out.
It is fun to be in the same decade with you. Roosevelt cabled Churchill.
That's a fascinating. You should say that to your friends next time. Hey, it's fun to be in the same decade with you. Like,
I feel like that's. I mean, is that a compliment? Like, I mean, it's like not fun to be your friends. Like, it's fun to exist in the relatively the same time period as you.
I mean, if you say that to someone you did not like, no, of course not.
It's nice to exist on the planet at the same time as you. Yeah, like I don't know.
I mean, I think I don't know. I don't know if that means they're best buds, but I think at least he had a sense of humor about the just the unfortunate time they were in. You know what I mean? I think like we would all have some sentiment about like coworkers with 2020. You know, like, oh, it's good to be in 2020 with you. You know, just because it's been like
Okay. I don't know why everyone is putting up so much resistance to FDR and Churchill being friends. This friendship, people say, may have dramatically changed the outcome of the war. This is what Churchill said in remarks of FDR's deaths. In Roosevelt, there died the greatest I've ever known. Does that sound like something you'd say about a coworker?
I don't know, because you cut out again.
Okay, does this sound like something you would say to a coworker? In Roosevelt, there died the greatest American friend I've ever known.
No, assuming he had more American friends than just Roosevelt. Okay, so regardless of whether they're best friends or just they went through a rough time together,
I do think it's worth. I think it's worth. I don't know where we'll get it in here, but Japan sparked us getting into the war. We're longtime friends with Great Britain. We were the best friends who got in a fist fight, found our own differences, and became best friends. Germany's obviously the main instigator here, but Japan got us into the war. And the quote, does everyone know the quote that I'm about to say? Can you see where I'm going? Can you telegraph this?
I think I know where you're going.
I think it's just important to document, like, they were the instigators for this speech. They're the reason we got there. Isoroku Yamamoto, the naval marshal, the head of the Japanese Navy, as soon as this occurred in a movie, but also a real quote, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," upon the attacks of him commanding his army to attack the United States. So they already knew what they were messing with once they did it.
Again, to my point earlier, though, if he says that immediately after, like, why did he do it in the first place? But anyway.
All right, hold on. Just to be sure, I'm getting a correction here, real time.
He definitely says that in the movie. I've seen the movie.
Several movies have said this. No one can actually trace its roots to Yamamoto saying this. I do apologize. Napoleon said something similar. China is a sickly, sleeping giant, but when she awakes, the world will tremble, which is kind of true of 2020 even, maybe. But all right. That is not officially ascribed to any Japanese admiral.
Thank you for the fact check, but the movie does say it, so we'll leave it there. Anyway, so to kind of bring it all together, so looking here, so we've talked a lot about FDR, his life, blah, blah, blah. So I just want to read one paragraph. And yes, this is from Wikipedia, so take it for what it is. But speaking of FDR, so the things he did, like we said, president for longer than any other of the United States, Great Depression, World War II. So this is the paragraph I want to read. Roosevelt is widely considered to be one of the most important figures in the history of the United States, as well as one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. Historians and political scientists consistently rank Roosevelt, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln as the three greatest presidents. Reflecting on Roosevelt's presidency, which brought the United States through the Great Depression and World War II to a prosperous future, said FDR biographer Gene Edward Smith in 2007, he lifted himself from a wheelchair to lift the nation from its knees. So you can't get much higher praise than that. So before we close, according to historians and political scientists, if you have Roosevelt, Washington, and Lincoln between the three, so you've got George Washington, the Revolutionary War, Abe Lincoln, the Civil War, and now you've got FDR, World War II. So among the three of them, who do you take? Landon, you're first.
Who do we got? Three?
So between the three of them, who do you take? Three presidents, three super influential figures, three leaders doing three of our greatest wars.
Hold on. FDR, Lincoln, and Washington.
Yep.
Oh. Gosh, I don't know.
I-
The reason is the whole entire premise of why you would select one of these. I do think, Washington's only dealing with a couple million people. Lincoln's dealing with maybe tens of million. And FDR has almost the entire world's fate in his hands. And so I think the modernity of his challenge was pretty impressive. And I do like Lincoln, but I would put FDR on the same level as Lincoln.
Matt, who you going with?
Landon, are you even from Illinois?
I was shocked
Putting
when Landon did not choose Lincoln.
FDR at the
So-
same level
so-
as Lincoln?
I
Put it on
think
paper,
I
Landon
do think
chose a
I think
Democrat
Lincoln
over Abraham Lincoln.
I think Lincoln and FDR had a much bigger challenge than Washington. I think Washington led a band of rebels on their own land against the B team of the British Army, and all right, we got our own country, and now we don't have to pay a tea tax. Great. Lincoln solved a moral problem against people who are brothers, amongst, the same country. FDR had two fronts of battle, employing every ounce of resource of economic and time of every American. It was big. So
All right, Landon picked FDR. Matt, who do you got?
I'm gonna go Lincoln, then Washington, then FDR.
Landon gave a very detailed answer. Do you have
Yeah.
something similar?
I mean, I would say, yeah. Reason I say Lincoln first. Yeah. I mean, I think just I know it's not the same worldwide stage that FDR was dealing with, but just the incredible division, and tumultuousness of that era, as well as just dealing with, for among one of the, I know the British, I believe they outlawed slavery before we did, But really being on the forefront of that moral issue, really for the entire world. Like until then, until that era, I suppose the British did it a little bit before we did, but until that era, slavery was not questioned terribly, terribly hard, throughout the known world. So I mean, I really do think that is a historical and monumental thing for him to implement in the United States. George Washington, to characterize that as just getting rid of a T tax and rebelling against the British B team, I think is a little bit of an understatement. He presided over what I, as a true American, see as I mean, we have the longest standing constitution in the history of the world. I mean, we're really like it really is an exceptional thing that he kind of got started, especially with him stepping down because he
You
had a
can't, you
lot of
can't,
opportunity.
you can't credit the U.S. Constitution to Washington.
I'm not crediting him with it, but his role, one, in leading our country as a general, and then two, being the the presider over that. I mean, yeah, he didn't write the whole thing himself, but he was certainly involved and certainly was a monumental figure with that. Um, yeah, I mean, FDR is right up there. Like it is tough. I'm not trying to poo-poo FDR, um, because he did deal with a lot, just on the international scale. Um, but yeah, that's what I would say.
All right, Mike, what do you got?
Um, the Civil War probably would have become World War One if not for Lincoln. So Lincoln number one there. Um, FDR this number two because Landon made some great points, and Washington number three because Matt made some great points.
Wait. What do you mean by Civil War would have been World War One? I've never
Also,
heard
your
that.
points were so good, Matt. He put him as last.
Got it.
I'm mostly jokey. I mean, of course, I don't know. Then again, the French were no, what was that? The British. What were the British doing in Civil War? There were some international items there, but no. Does the times make the man or does the man make the times? I think I heard that in the film Lincoln. So it's really hard to say, if FDR had formed the United States instead of Washington, maybe Bernie Sanders would be president right now, president elect. So maybe thank God that FDR did not. Um, if Lincoln had been there during the Depression, um, I don't know. How would the world look different? Um, I'm no, I got nothing. I'm just rambling on. But
That would be a really fun thing to do. Would be to flip flop presidents. Yeah, that would be a really interesting exercise. Dang.
I'll throw my 2 cents in then. I'm gonna go Lincoln number one. Your guys all gave really detailed political reasons. Mine is I'm sitting in Springfield, Illinois, and I have a picture of Abe Lincoln in my house. So Lincoln all the way for number one. Number two, Landon, you made some really good points about FDR. I do like that. But Matt, I liked your point a lot that Washington stepped down. So I'm gonna go Washington and FDR. I'm gonna do it. So we are now past. We'll fight on the beaches. We've evacuated the British military. They're safe. They can fight on. We're through the Great the Great Depression. We're already through that, but now we're through the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. has decided to enter in to the war. Where to really learn about World War II through the speeches of its most influential people? Where should we go next?
I think the only appropriate spot to go next would be the beaches of Normandy, the beaches of Omaha. That was one of the beaches, right? I don't know, but we'll learn next week when we go over a speech to prepare our troops, our courageous men, on D-Day or on the eve of D-Day. George Patton will be the speaker for next 2 weeks, whatever. The next episode of the speech, guys.